Jack, can you send me the link?
Yeah, I'm just getting it. Do you want to do the Discord post or rely?
Oh yeah, I got it.
Oh, amazing.
Check Messenger.
So I can't read the chat without that like going on the stream. Is that okay?
No, hold on.
Okay.
Start time, guys. Can you confirm you guys are already in the chat?
I can hear you.
You're here. Is Jess here? Jess?
I think just is going to the bathroom and will be here.
Okay, no, that's
I'm back.
Oh, okay, cool. Daniel? Oh, he's good. They're connected to audio.
He's here. He's just, yeah.
All right, cool. Daniel, can you hear us?
Yep, I can hear you.
Yeah. Perfect. Alrighty. Welcome everyone to the Battle of the CAs demo debate of Madrid WUDC 2023 CAs versus the potentially Vietnam WUDC 2024 CAs, judged by the lovely Beatrice, who is now going to wave and say hi. So she's up on the screen. Awesome. You're muted, Beatrice.
Hello.
There you go. The motion will be the round 6 motion of WUDC 2022. Best of luck to all the teams and have fun. And thank you very much for all of them for giving this demo workshop, and Beatrice for judging.
Sorry, just let me get up my timer. Excellent. Everyone ready? Sorry, this online stopwatch is not working. 1 second. Okay, ready. We were so close to having a perfect response to the COVID-19 recession. Governments came together to take advantage of low interest rates, to spend the necessary money to tide over their economies, to stop rot from setting in, and to make sure that the overall economy did not, in response to this short-term shock, collapse. Unfortunately, political pressures that exist in many of the largest economies around the world meant that they didn't stop there. They didn't make accurate decisions about how much money they could put into the economy before inflation, the silent killer of livelihoods and living standards, crept into those nations' economic performance. On our side of the house, that crisis would have played out the same in the beginning when we were making economically sensible decisions, but differently at the end, where short-term political incentives hijacked our ability to make sensible decisions, and in the end have created an inflation crisis that has stripped the quality of life and the purchasing power of many, especially of the poorest people. What I'll explain in this debate is firstly a note of framing about what are the types of central banks that are captured within this motion and why it inherently presumes independence in the way that those central banks operate. I'm then going to describe the people who get appointed to these institutions and how they come to the decisions about how they introduce and maintain economic policy. Then I will discuss the 2 types of crises that exist. Crises in which we are facing inflation, and austerity is the necessary step in order to make sure that the economy doesn't overheat, and that especially in developing economies, your dollar-denominated debt doesn't become completely out of control because of the effect of inflation. And then I'll talk about recession, where unfortunately certain governments, be it by chance, even if they aren't the majority of them, are ideologically committed to making sure that you keep your deficit low, to making sure that you keep the government small, which ends up having a catastrophic effect on the ability to be able to recover from economic decline. So, bit of framing. It is important to note within this debate that if a central bank is not independent, the government and the central bank will essentially make the same decisions, right? Because if the government is calling the shots of how that central bank operates, there is no debate. It is essentially a unitary decision, and it doesn't matter who has formal control over the fiscal powers and the monetary powers that exist in the state's toolbox, because they're called the same. The corollary of that is that this debate is also only really pertinent in situations where the government disagrees with the central bank, where government incentives take over and mean that it makes decisions that a sensible central bank would not make. That limits the scope of this debate, importantly, only to areas where the government is making a decision that a bunch of people with PhDs who have been appointed by those governments in respect and reflect broad economic consensuses would encourage them not to make that particular decision. There, of course, may be claims from the opposition that this will somehow further endanger the independence of banks. But I'll note that the overall trend that has happened from the introduction of central banks is to recognize that central banks actually make excellent decisions about preserving the long-term financial health. And yes, it was a huge step for the government to give up simply monetary independence of this operation. We see absolutely no reason why this wouldn't continue, and why the overwhelming success that has happened with central banks taking advantage and taking over monetary policy wouldn't also extend spend to financial policy. I'll take a point of information.
Okay, so if central banks are great and independent, why didn't central banks raise interest rates, which is under their domain, while the fiscal governments were running errands?
So the reason why they rose rates is because they recognized that we were about to head into an inflationary crisis. And in many cases, they did raise rates, but the important thing to recognize is raising rates is often not enough. If your government is willing to spend enormous amounts of money, you can raise rates as much as you want without it having any effect. And I'd also note, importantly, there is one constraint on raising rates so much in response to a government having wild spend or out of control spending or passing something like the enormous stimulus in the United States. And that is that raising interest rates suddenly and aggressively can freak out the market. So they weren't necessarily willing to make sudden moves, but that doesn't mean that if they had full control, they wouldn't be able to create a system that operates effectively. So who gets appointed within these systems? Few notes. They tend to be independent. They tend to care about their legacy and long-term outcomes and balance the demand and find essentially the balance between growth and demand and inflation. They have historically had a shifting role, but we note that they reflect the broad economic consensus within these countries without the pressures in the moment to ditch those principles. It is an extraordinary difficult job, but one they necessarily do well. It is also important to note that perception often follows performance. Central banks have an aura of power. Like, we think ordinary people, by and large, just get money from the government, but don't really care about who is making those financial decisions. But businesses and IMF respect the type of authority and expertise that are reflected by those central banks. So just from a perceptual level, not only are these central banks able to do better, but they're able to convince the market that they will do better. Moving to the two types of crises that we think now central banks will be able to deal with better. The first is the instance where inflation has become too high and it is necessary to take steps to stop it. This can happen in cases like with COVID-19, but most commonly happens in economies like Argentina, which has a very independent central bank, but also a government that is willing to take aggressive and frankly obscene steps to spend money at a rate that it simply cannot justify with the productivity at that market. And this means that central banks have to do something that is quite politically unpopular. And they can do something that is quite politically unpopular because they are not subject to short-term electoral incentives. They're subject to long-term outcomes, but necessarily get appointed by these people. So when you are appointed by a political like consensus, it means that you make decisions that are broadly in line with the interests of the public, but you aren't displaced from those principles easily by short-term electoral incentives. What it means that they do is these central banks identify that there can be a spiral with developing economies, specifically when they have huge amounts of debt denominated in foreign currencies, that if they increase the inflation, they make it much more difficult for themselves to pay off that debt. Because instead of having to pay 10 pesos per the dollar that you have to pay 20 pesos or 30 pesos. Of course, if you're the government and your voter base really wants you to keep large state parastatals operating that employ a lot of people, even if it will drive them into this hyperinflationary problem, they make those types of decisions, and it leads to the repeated bailouts that you have to see from the IMF to Argentina. So you're likely, and I think this is just the first most important thing, to stop these types of short-term inflationary crises. But the second thing to note is there are also instances in which you have a recession that isn't necessarily inflationary, like after the GFC with the collapse of the financial system. And sometimes you will simply have conservative governments, like existed in the UK at the time, that are debt hawks that want want to make sure that you don't ramp up your spending, even though you have your central banks over your shoulder, encouraging you desperately to take advantage of those interest rates and drag your population out of poverty. That is something that you weren't capable of doing simply because you made prior political commitments. At the end of this debate, we're very happy to stand for economic decisions being made by those who have the expertise and the incentives.
Good to go, or?
Yeah, you're good to go.
Cool. 4 things in this speech. Firstly, some mitigation, then a principle, then why we think there'll be bad decision-making on their side, and why we think this will change the way in which central banks operate in a much broader level. Firstly, some mitigation. I think the first thing to observe is that politicians are perfectly capable of listening to the expertise of both the central bank, but also other economic advisors on their side. They have incentives to do so because they obviously want to make the most informed policy decisions they can. Where they often defer from the advice that they've been given is where they think there is another social consideration that is at play. For example, a trade-off of vulnerable populations. I'm going to expand upon this a little bit more in my principled material. But the second thing I'd note is that central banks already have the capacity to control monetary policy under the status quo. That looks like things like, for example, the decision about whether to refinance government bonds or control interest rates. That is to say that they have a fairly large degree of influence over the way in which economic crises are managed. It is unclear what the specific delta of managing fiscal policy is from opening government's end. I think already this material serves to mitigate a large amount of the impetus that comes from opening government. But the next thing I'm going to do is have a broad principle claim about why this is illegitimate. There are a couple things to note here. The main one is just to say, a lot of the decisions that you're making are fundamentally subjective decisions. That is to say, the decision about whether you would sooner recover from a crisis at the expense of, for example, causing more initial shock is a subjective decision. The decision about whether to weigh off a perhaps larger but more speculative harm of, for example, a future financial shock versus a very human concern about people having the money to spend and have food on their tables is a subjective one. I do not have the objective answers to weigh those things. Also, generally weighing short-term versus longer needs. Those things are inherently subjective questions and ones that I just don't think that any one person has the answer to. The importance of this is just to say that is why we defer to elected individuals. Now, I appreciate they do not necessarily have the perfect capacity to represent the decisions of every one group in a population, but we generally accept that the purpose of democracy is to aggregate those preferences and then to come at a reasonably a reasonable conclusion at the end of that about what is important. It is unclear why the simple preference of weathering an economic crisis in the shortest term is automatically and by default the most important consideration. And if they can, unless they can prove that in totality, I would rather defer to the general democratic system that allocates and decides about what subjective preferences we hold are most important. The importance of this material is just to suggest that I think it is non-contingent on any practical outcome in this debate, as well as the considerations that we often apply here, that is what governments often choose to prioritize, not all the time, but some of the time, are often considerations that are important, e.g. how we help the most vulnerable. But before I continue on at examining bad decision-making, I will take a point of information from opening government.
Jess, don't you think it's naive to assume that voters have a clear vision of how they want monetary policy to operate in order to maintain their preferences, and that politicians won't happily lie to these voters in order to sell their long-term futures out for short-term electoral gains?
So I think that more people have more of a capacity to decide what is in their best interest than you might think they do. I think people are able to recognize and weigh off the, again, speculative risk of something happening in the future versus their desire to have food on the table for their family. But also, I think, the extent to which politicians distort facts and lie are things that can obviously be mitigated, e.g. media scrutiny, e.g. opposition parties. I don't think this is a big deal in this debate. Why do we get worse decision-making? I think there are a number of things that would be fine to concede in this debate, and a number of things that are symmetric. For example, we're probably willing to concede that these experts are experts. They have a lot of knowledge. That's fine. Probably some things that are symmetric are, being from privileged institutions. Probably bankers and politicians are probably the same level of privilege. That doesn't probably change dramatically. They say that politicians are, however, more short-term focused. Number one, I don't know why being short-term focused is inherently a bad thing, but I would suggest that that's not always necessarily true. Politicians are often concerned about things like legacy, and bankers are often concerned about things like immediate promotions that they get when they appease their bosses and those sorts of things. So I don't think this is particularly definitive in resolving in favor of opening government. What I will say, and what is unique, is the following. The first is that people who often enter this field are often influenced by certain dominant types of economic ideology that push them into making certain types of decisions. That is to say that often the ideology that is supported by bankers is often one that represents drastic spending cuts and smaller spending, which often actually not only hurts the most vulnerable populations, but has economic impacts that are actually counterproductive. That is often when you strip spending, you often look like things in Greece, where they were unable to revive their economy because they did not have as much money circulating in the economy. And the response you might get to this is, but why would they do that if that's bad? Well, because they're blinded by the economic ideology that they follow is the simple reason. But the second thing is that I just am not clear that central bankers are equipped to make these types of decisions. A lot of the educational upbringing they have focuses on monetary policy, not fiscal policy, which is a very distinct thing. And I think that reallocation of skills is one that is significant and takes a lot of time to catch up. So I think these decisions will not be particularly good. And I think this responds to the various scenarios that opening government give us. The final thing I want to analyze in this debate is how appointments change. I think the specific tipping point is that governments often feel a degree of control or want a degree of control over fiscal policy because they see that as being significant to the way in which they enact their government agenda. So I think now you in fact will get more politicization, and I think this will occur to varying extents depending on the weakness of those institutions. OG says, well, if they were already going to be political cronies, they would have done so anyway. That ignores the specific tipping point of feeling that that fiscal policy is now out of your control. Why is this bad? Two reasons. Firstly, it's just bad because you have worse people appointed on these central banks that are less likely to be the best experts in their field. And that is bad for the reason that we're not just talking about decisions about economic crises, but also times when the central banks are making decisions outside of those crises, but also on monetary policy. Again, that is distinct from fiscal policy. The second reason that this is bad is because it has a perceptional impact. That is, if you think that these people are less experts as a result, you're less willing to trust their advice. That means there is more ambiguity when it comes to listening to economic signals. That probably also, for example, means that states are less likely to trust you, cooperate with you, invest in you in the longer term. For all of these reasons, we're very proud to oppose.
Can everyone hear me? The worst thing for countries in the aftermath of economic crisis was mass overspending, especially in times where you were already in a situation of economic downturn. Because as Daniel pointed out in PM, this is the point where external creditors questioned your ability to pay off your debts. It's where they were likely to pay out and pull out money if they didn't think you would repay. And it's where they were likely to not finance you in the future. And I want to be clear, this comes before any of their harms at any given point in time. Their case is largely a case about monetary policy sovereignty. You lose that at the point that you are in a financial crisis where people are putting austerity on you in exchange for accepting IMF bailouts. You lose that at the point where you are Greece, where your economy is constrained by what the ECB does because they say, we no longer trust you to make these decisions. And if you ever want to get money again, you have to give up your sovereignty. All of their harms happen in a world where countries are forced to give up their ability to control their fiscal and monetary policy because they are so neck deep in a crisis where they cannot get themselves out. If they want to talk about Greece, we're happy to argue examples all day. The fact of the matter is that we think probably Greece would have been better if some rational central banker had been able to say, let's cap the budget before Syriza just starts wasting all their money on the stupidest possible social programs that never actually get us any return. Let's cap our budget before we have to lock into austerity, before we have to lock into the budget cuts that come down the line. And this is important because Daniel told you that people, especially politicians, are likely to overspend because it mitigates the short-term burden on people so that they re-elect you when central bankers are less concerned about this. Now, Jess says, that there's mitigation because generally people listen to the advice of central bankers. That is exactly the case. So our debate does not happen in that many instances, but the debate it happens in are the worst instances, the ones in which people are likely to ignore the advice of rational, realistic central bankers because they know there's an election coming and they are far more worried about the 1 month cost than the 2-year cost and the 1-year cost. So they don't care that in the next election, they're going to get shellacked because they lose all this control, because they have all this debt and they aren't able to get out of it. They care about what happens right now in the short term. The response at best is just a question of legacy. And I want to question this realistically. I think the vast majority of politicians intuitively care far more about their re-election prospects because you see them flip-flopping all the time based on what will get them re-elected. Very few politicians are consistent and concerned about legacy because they flip-flop all the time. So I just think they're wrong there. What we're not talking about is Keynesian stimulus spending. Like, look, in 2008, central bankers said, we probably want to have more financing, more stimulus rather than less. What we are talking about is stopping Greece, stopping Hungary, stopping all the countries that went crazy in 2011, tried to vastly overspend, and their debt and their credit are still questioned to this day. In and of itself, that should win us the round, because there's no way that you can finance the programs that either side wants if you cannot even get the credit that you need in 2 or 3 years' time. I think that new substantive wins us the round, but I want to talk very quickly about the principle. Every decision a government bureaucrat makes has some subjectivity. When you make the trade-off between inflation and unemployment, you are obviously making the subjective trade-off that Jess already talked about. But we think it's good to delegate those decisions to people because, one, it's just the way we accept in republics and democratic republics that it's okay to delegate some level of decision-making to people that aren't elected because we think they have better information of it. And two, I would point out, this policy is literally that. It is not the case that central bankers can say, hey, you need to do the Green New Deal. You can't do the Green New Deal. They say, hey, there's a limit about how much we're going to let you spend, and here is how much you must receive in tax revenue if you're going to do that. So there's no actual change. At best, it is literally an extension of making the same sort of decision that we've already talked about. I think the last thing to say here is just, I'm unclear as to why we care about democratic principles. Like, I think every debater makes these arguments, but I think very rarely do they actually tell you why it is important to defer to the quote unquote general system of democratic decision making. I think it's much better and much more important for politicians in these cases to be risk averse, because you are literally talking about things that determine people's ability to buy their house, feed their families, make sure they have a job, all of these sorts of things that we are happy saying it is better that unelected experts take more of a control over because they are better at determining the optimal balance for people. They say, but politicians will care about the distributional effects. I say that is as vague and uncertain as it is on our side of the house. I actually think central bankers in the United States, for example, do a very good job considering distributional effects. That's one of the main things that Jerome Powell and Lael Brainard have been prioritizing in the Federal Reserve decision-making this sort of time. The last thing I want to talk about is decision-making. I want to talk about why we get vastly better decision-making on our side of the house. The first thing to say here is, I think they just quibble about the short-term focus versus the legacy building. I think we've cleared that up, but I also want to clear out why central bankers are just much better. One, they are not likely to ever need or get advancement. Central bankers don't return to Goldman Sachs. If they were there, they'd already been working there. There's no actual incentive for them to be able to do anything drastically new. The second thing to point out here is obviously the vast majority of central bankers are academics. So them doing a policy does not change that they will still have tenure at MIT when they get back. I'll take a POI from Op if they have one in the meantime.
I mean, we agree with the value of having fiscal conservative budgets, but don't you think that this decreases the value of having that in the political arena for political parties?
No. The last thing I want to talk about under that is the dominant ideology aspect of it. I think this is just a very generic claim that is made that all neoliberal, all economists are neoliberal, which one, I don't think is true. But two, I would point out economists are the ones that are most likely to rationally update their priors when they see new data. The people that do not update their priors are the ones who are wedded to a political ideology, which is their side. So on our side, central bankers know what they are doing is wrong, if there is wrong, and update it and change and do something better. On their side, Democrats, Republicans, liberals, conservatives, it doesn't matter. You stick to the same ideology you have, even if it is not working, because deviations from it are punished. And I think that actually does answer Lovro's POI, because you don't get this lovely democratic sphere notion of should we have fiscally conservative budgets budgets, or should we have fiscally liberal budgets? If it's the same two people yelling for 100 years, we should have fiscally liberal or fiscally conservative budgets with no actual updating in, are we wrong? Are we making any change? At least the field of economics has changed over time. I don't think Democrats and Republicans have. The very last thing I want to talk about is the degree of control that people have over fiscal policy. I think we beat this at PM, where we said, obviously giving up control of monetary sovereignty was a very important thing, and it didn't actually change what governments did. Like, obviously it was as impactful as this policy is in and of itself. The second thing to say is, I just don't think this policy is dramatically changing. It is in times of crisis. It is a very large cap. It is not the sort of thing that changes, are you able to actually do the sort of programs that you want? Because people have much more politically salient conversations about that. Cheers.
See you, Aditya. Bye. Can you guys hear me? I think you can, right? Okay, I'll start soon. I mean, I think the last sentence of Aditya's speech was how they should have framed this debate, right? They should have talked about how central bankers are not going to go as much rogue. They're going to discuss this with politicians. They're going to have the final say, but they're going to move the actual outcomes of the policy by a margin because they have more leverage over the government in this alternative system. How they did frame this debate is they're going to do a totally different thing to what the politicians are doing currently. So I think that's the burden which they set upon themselves in terms of the impacts and the differentiatory policies which they're going to make under this system compared to the status quo. So I think that's important to recognize how parts of their case actually interact with each other. But I think that in the status quo, we have meaningful ways to influence fiscal policy by monetary means. We can choose to refinance bonds or not refinance bonds if governments are behaving responsibly or not responsibly. We can implement strict rules like ECB when you will support government debts, for example, like no over-indebtedness, or like that you do not spend too much, etc. Like the new transmission protection instrument recently voted yesterday. So this is the status quo, how they act in reality. We can counteract fiscal policy if they're spending too much. We can increase the interest rates, etc., etc. There are ways how you can affect fiscal policy in the status quo as a central bank, right? This is an important mitigation. I just want to recognize that the current inflation is not caused by fiscal stimuluses exclusively that could potentially be stopped at their side of the house. In US, for example, this accounts for only half of the inflation. In EU, even less, given the fiscal stimulus was smaller. The rest is crash of supply chains, war in Ukraine, the great resignation, strikes, etc., which I think limits the extent to which they can achieve the goals which they're trying to achieve with this kind of debate. And another important point of characterization is that I agree with opening argument here. They did a really good job of describing how central bankers look like. What is their pedigree? What are their incentives? What is their history, reputation, experience? But they also, on the other hand, described why these people are completely unable to do anything which relates to the political arena, fiscal budget, negotiating with local governments, basically like legislative, etc., etc. Because I want you to imagine a banker who is going to sell a fiscally conservative budget on TV and see how that is going to, be played in media and how people are going to accept this. That's the problem. Every time they characterize these people as detached from the political system, that actually makes them detached from the political system. And fiscal policy is throughout times an inherent political conflict of systems and different interests. And you need a strong political character to balance these in order to have political stability, right? I think what also is important here is that we do not believe the central bankers are ideal predictors of the market. They're not experts without mistakes. They didn't predict the current inflation to the extent it happened. They didn't react in regulating the financial market pre-2007 crisis. They misjudged the fiscal multipliers in 2010 crisis, prolonging actually the crisis in a lot of countries. They awfully reacted in Greece and other PIGS cases where ECB played a key role in supporting hawks. And notice that the role of central banks in all of this stuff was after the crisis had started. So their argument about how the debt wouldn't be accumulated does not apply in this motion, right? It might be applied to some other motion, but they would have no power here. So like the POI kind of proves on our side of the house, central bankers are not as independent as OG characterizes, right? They make framing that this is a debate not about these banks then. But I want to point out to ECB and Fed, which haven't and obviously didn't raise rates high or early enough at the time where they had the prerogative to do that. So if that is their interpretation of them being not independent, I have no idea what central banks we are even discussing in this motion. Why am I running this? Why am I discussing about this? Because if they are struggling to remain independent in times of crisis already, as OG concedes because they didn't raise rates, then it is a big risk to give them more responsibility, not power, but responsibility in times when crisis happens in running the fiscal policy. Now, why they won't get more independent? Because you might think, okay, but now they have more power, so they're going to get more independent. Because the same structural reasons, right? They are not independent to the extent that OG wants them to be in status quo, still apply, right? I mean, they still get re-elected, so they still have the incentive to listen to the politicians because they want a second term as well. Not only Biden wants a second term, Powell wants a second term as well, right? So not steering the pot too much, as they recognize in PM speech, probably also applies. Why would you want to steer the pot in fiscal terms if you don't want to steer it in monetary terms? Like caring about political outcomes of their decisions so that they do not get scapegoated and basically drawn in like media as the single people who are taking away bread from hardworking people when they're like, increasing taxes or reducing spending. Same reason applies. So I think basically recognize that they also can't plan for this. They cannot plan for a future crisis and build up huge departments of experts, etc. While governments do have these departments under the fiscal department, under the Ministry of Finance, etc., etc. They can plan for the monetary aspect of this, right? But not for crisis. You're not going to create your whole setup of how the bank looks like just because you have one duty which you're going to perform in crisis every 10 years or so. Before I point to why this leads to horrible impacts for central banking, I want to take OG.
While we accept that it's often very difficult to predict this and central banks may need to rely on the civil service, much like politicians do, don't you accept it's better to have a single, clear, consistent approach rather than swinging wildly between the ideological poles that change every time a new government comes into power?
I'm not sure. I think single points of authority sometimes work very well. For example, look at this WDC. So Miloš is a CA, and then as CA, he appoints himself as a song officer, and then he posts his own song in the song channel. So that's an example of how things work out well. But if someone was like less well-intentioned, maybe they would have posted a really bad song or something like that. So I'm not really sure that inherently putting all of your eggs in one basket in times of crisis is a smart thing to do, especially given that people did have some input in choosing these governments. What are other negative consequences which are going to happen, basically as a consequence of this? First of all, they will lose credibility when their stamp of approval is now directly on the budget, right? No matter what the budget looks like, and I've proven that the budget is not going to be as conservative as they want it to be, all of the other people who now believe you, because in the status quo, you can say the budget is too expansionary, you should reduce spending, now believe you less, because your stamp of approval is on that very same budget, unless it's super, super conservative, in which case there's probably problems, as I pointed out before, when central bankers were overly conservative. Secondly, they're elected as more leanish central bankers, the status quo, because you have to deal with them in times of crisis. So both political parties, all political, basically people agree now, okay, we want someone who we're going to be able to more squeeze in times of crisis because we don't want to lose political momentum, etc. But also there are more political appointments inside of the house, right? In the civil service in central banks to compensate for this kind of like issue. And I think lastly, central banks get a lot of pressure, which they cannot deal with, which makes their other side of the job, which is more important, monetary policy, unviable. Thank you very much.
All right. Hello. Okay. All right. Hello. Hi, my name is Bea. I am going to be giving the very brief oral adjudication for the demo debate. I was asked to provide a couple of talking points, but not necessarily go into detail. But nonetheless, I hope that it will suffice. Anyway, so the format of my oral adjudication is going to be decision. So whether it's opening government or opening opposition, and then a couple of talking points for why the decision came out to be the way it was. Simply put, with me as the only person with the vote, it goes towards opening government. So the motion passes, it does not fail. There are a couple of talking points. I think broadly, first of all, the thing to note is that both sides of the House tend to talk on whether or not the central bank or, for example, the government would be a good arbiter of determining certain monetary or fiscal policy. So, for example, with regards to things like the various tax limits or, for example, increasing overall government spending. But there are different ways that they decide to go about this. The first thing they want to engage upon is exactly with regards to the degree to which the central bank has an interest to support long-term goals for the economy. So under opening government, specifically as early as Prime Minister, they suggest things such as it is the central bank that is able, for example, to care about the long term, often because they strike the demand between demand and inflation, and they strike the balance between that. They reflect broad economic interests. And often, if it was also from a reputational standpoint, they have power, businesses and IMF perspective, from perceptual level, the better. And this is in comparison to what opening opposition is suggesting, for example, wherein while it is true, for example, that there are long-term interests, it is not automatic, or it is not intuitive that short-term interests are automatically lesser. And insofar as in the context of an economic crisis, there are tons of people, for example, that want to have food on the table. There are tons of people, for example, who want to have shelter. It becomes imperative that we allow the government to be able to decide, or the ability, for example, to increase or decrease, for example, the amount of government spending that they have. So my first assessment of this is that I think that on opening opposition, there requires some response, for example, towards what exactly do we do about future cases in which this short-term spending, or assuming that we do get, for example, the benefits from short-term spending, affects long-term spending. So for example, as identified by both Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister, with regards to hyperinflation, for example, tons of people having to, or rather countries, for example, having to resort to bailouts as a result of increasing the amount of money, for example, that they're spending. But second of all, there was also a discussion with regards to whether or not central bankers, or these bankers in general, will be credible. There are a couple of reasons they provide why they're credible, or rather why they're not credible on opening opposition. So for example, things like, while it is true that politicians are beholden to electoral interest, or for example, political interest or ideological interest, it is true that bankers, for example, are not reliable for reasons such as they're beholden to short-term interests, for example, like promotions and other things like that. They don't study the specific type of financial policy that is required or affected by this motion, and other things like that. The first issue I had with that is I think there needs to be more explanation on how those specific characteristics lead to poor decisions. So for example, when they're suggesting that bankers want immediate promotions, there needs to be explanation on how this does specifically result in faulty decisions, because at the very least on opening government, it's explained to me that because, for example, people within the state, or people who are politicians, for example, have the interest to pander to voters and want to put food on their table, that's what leads to them increasing government spending. And that's what leads to hyperinflation, for example, or overspending such that you have to resort to bailouts and other very terribly financial things like that. But second of all, when comparing the degree to which they explain that a central bank, for example, opening government, or for example, politicians on opening opposition are more reliable, opening opposition needs to robustly respond more to the idea that politicians are beholden to the ideologies of their respective party. Because while I do understand, for example, that the response from Deputy Leader for Opposition, for example, was the idea that it's important to have singular authority, it's important, for example, to have politicians in the mix with regards to making these decisions, the argument that comes from opening government isn't necessarily that we need a diverse set of people, but rather that we need people whose interests are not beholden to principles or are beholden to specific political parties, but rather people that are flexible and open to change based on new and existing data or outcomes of the certain decisions that they've made. So what is required from opening opposition is an explanation for why exactly politicians, even if they may be beholden to, liberal, conservative, democratic, Republican principles, are still likely to make good decisions, first of all, but second of all, won't be somewhat paralyzed by the political infighting that is suggested in Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister. So very briefly, that's the overview of why it is likely that the government motion passes, and why it is preferable that in the case of economic crises, it is preferable that we adapt this type of model as opposed to government spending and other policies like that be put into the decisions and the hands of politicians and the government.